China's economy grew 5.2% last year, which is slightly more than the official target, but the recovery was far shakier than many had expected. Can you share your overall outlook on the world's second largest economy, with the post-reopening momentum expected to fade this year?
Well, I think when we talk about that post-recovery momentum, I think it's already faded. The recovery we saw in 2023 really underwhelmed a lot of people's initial expectations. And I think one of the reasons for that is when you look at some of the structural issues in the Chinese economy, ranging from bad debt to misallocation of investments to issues in property, demographics, these are all things that are weighing down the Chinese economy in ways that are a lot more prominent than I think a lot of people were used to in the 2010s. And so when we look out to the remainder of the 2020s, we are expecting growth to continue on this moderating path. We're likely going to see growth below 5% over the remainder of this decade. And so one of the things that we need to prepare ourselves for is the fact that the era of high growth in China, that era is over. And really the questions now are, can China really resolve these really big issues around bad debts, around its over-reliance on property investments, and of course, the worsening geopolitical picture, which is complicating everything in addition to those domestic strains that I just talked about.
Moody's lowered the outlook on China's A1 debt rating to negative from stable in December, citing its growing debt and property crisis. And China's debt to GDP ratio climbed to a new record high of 287% in 2023, while over half of China's 31 provincial-led governments have set GDP growth targets that are lower than last year's. How concerning is China's debt problem?
So it is concerning. I mean, one of the things that is kind of a mitigating factor is the fact that a lot of this debt is held domestically. Unlike other economies, other markets, China has a lot of flexibility when it comes to responding to crisis. It doesn't politically have to answer to certain politicians or certain segments of the population regarding bailouts or other types of strategies or tactics that might be a bit more controversial in places like the West, for example. That is going to be a structural advantage. At the same time, there are still a lot of issues around the scale of China's bad debt. Officially, the non-performing loan ratio is around, say, very, very low, 1 to 2%. In reality, that ratio is likely much higher. And the reason I mention that is there's not a lot of transparency around how bad the problem actually is in China, particularly when we get into provinces where economic fundamentals are a bit more shaky, places like Guizhou, Yunnan, places in the Northeast and Dongbei, for example. These are all areas where there have long been issues with statistical transparency, government transparency. And so as China is looking to resolve these issues around debts, these issues tied to its property sector, first and foremost, it needs transparency. And in many parts of the country, that transparency just doesn't exist.
Chinese authorities have hinted that they won't resort to large-scale stimulus to revive growth amid challenges from deflationary pressures. Skeptics say that it'll be difficult for China to grow without stimulus. So what is your take on this?
So when we look at the growth picture for next year, for example, a lot of our assumptions, forecast at the EIU is we're expecting, around 4.7% real GDP growth. Those assumptions are anchored on the fact that the government is going to have to drive a lot of that growth. A lot of the investment we're expecting to materialize next year has to come from the state. And so that suggests that the state will have to play somewhat of a proactive role here in driving growth and kind of shepherding China through its malaise. In terms of stimulus, however, I think the way we think about stimulus in China versus how we think about stimulus in other markets, it's a little bit different. There is really strong reticence and hesitation among the Chinese leadership in terms of, say, direct transfers to households, cash handouts, other types of fiscal support to individual citizens to get them spending again. I think a lot of that stems from anxieties around inflation that materialized in the West over the past couple of years. I think Chinese leaders have been very, very worried about that. But also, I mean, historically, there's been a really strong aversion to this. And so when you think about stimulus, the stimulus is really not going to be directly benefiting those consumption-oriented sectors. It's not really going to be directly impacting households. If we do see stimulus, it's likely going to be similar to the old playbook of around infrastructure investment, construction activity. That could bring some activity for, say, commodities exporters or companies in kind of the raw materials space. But all of that being said, China's investment picture now is much different than it was in the 2010s. Not only are we seeing significant levels of saturation, we're also seeing those bigger issues around debt, fiscal and financial health, and this other kind of broader attempt by authorities to move the economy away from these, drivers like property and into other areas of more productive investment. And so when we think about stimulus, the stimulus that will likely materialize is probably still going to be relatively cautious. And it's likely not going to be enough to, on its own, lift China out of this deflationary grip that we're currently seeing the economy in.
A Hong Kong court has ordered what was once China's biggest property developer, Evergrande Group, to liquidate. What are your thoughts on whether this will further shape the Chinese real estate industry in 2024?
The biggest issue around that liquidation order is whether it will actually be honored in the mainland. Our assessment is that there's a relatively low chance that that's going to happen. And the reason for that is authorities in mainland China are much more concerned around political stability, social stability, economic stability. A liquidation order could throw all of that into jeopardy. Priority of many authorities in the mainland is ensuring the delivery of houses and assets that were promised by Evergrande to the people that made those purchases. And so a liquidation order would really be undermining that kind of principle and that idea. As a result, we don't think the liquidation order is necessarily going to have a significant reverberation throughout the property market in China, based on the assumption that it's not likely to be fully implemented. That could change if we do see the mainland courts honor that directive, but right now there are so many other structural things happening in the property sector that this likely isn't going to move the needle all that much yet.
What kinds of efforts is China making to transition away from its real estate dependent growth model? And would you say that they have been effective?
Yeah, there's been a huge focus in the last couple of years on driving particularly state resources into manufacturing. A lot of this has been driven by geopolitics. So, for example, the US export controls on certain types of advanced chips and chip making equipment destined for China. That's really jump-started this supply chain self-sufficiency strategy that has existed in China for years, but is really now commanding a lot more urgency because of the geopolitical situation. And so we are now seeing a really concerted effort by Chinese officials to try and mobilize state resources to support those industries and to cultivate kind of the industries of tomorrow. Chips is one area. Another very prominent area is electric vehicles. China has now become a major automotive exporter, and even though most of those cars are still traditional internal combustion engine vehicles, it is getting increasingly prominent. China's market share is getting increasingly expanded in terms of EVs. And so this all is, I think, very representative of this idea that manufacturing and expanding China's presence in the kind of industries of tomorrow, that's a strategic priority, and that's going to be one area where government officials see as somewhat of a solution towards finding new growth drivers and not relying as much on property. The question is, of course, how successful is this going to be? Right now, that same strategy is causing a lot of frictions with Western countries in particular. We have a very, very close eye on Europe right now, given the EU's concerns around Chinese electric vehicles. And so even if this strategy continues over the 2020s, this idea of promoting Chinese manufacturing, particularly in more advanced and emerging sectors, the question is this going to create tensions with the rest of the world?
What does the geopolitical landscape look like for China this year, with the US presidential election coming up and the European Union stepping up its trade protectionism?
Yeah, there's a lot to look at. I think China's diplomatic landscape in the 2020s is going to be markedly worse than the diplomatic landscape it enjoyed in the 2010s. We are seeing a number of different, countries and governments really start to reassess their relationship with China. It's not just the US. We have a particular eye on what's happening in Europe right now because the EU is waking up to the fact that China's economic model is posing significant, genuine competitive risks to its own economies. And that's something which I think is going to contextualize and characterize China-EU relations for the remainder of this decade and kind of likely pivot them into a much more strained place than before. And the thing is, the one thing to mention as well is that it's not just China's ties with the West. There's significant anxieties around its relationship with Taiwan, given that we have Lai Ching-te as the new Taiwanese president. He espouses a very China skeptic stance. And so there's a lot going on, which could very easily move things in the wrong direction. With the US, with Trump's potential return, that is likely going to be one of the biggest things that keeps Chinese investors up at night. The risk of a second Trump presidency, given how chaotic his first term was. And I think if we were to see Trump come back, he has already been floating some pretty aggressive trade policy actions. So, for example, this threat to impose a 10% tariff across all imports into the US, or to even remove China's most favored nation designation under US trade policy. All of these things would likely prove pretty disruptive to global commerce, particularly in regards to China's role on the global trade landscape. And that would set us up for a lot more uncertainty as we navigate into the years of 2025 and beyond.
Bloomberg projected in January that if China invaded Taiwan and a war broke out, South Korea's GDP would be cut by 23.3%. So, what are the implications of cross-strait relations for the Korean economy, especially at a time when its relationship with China has been on a rocky patch? And how real are the risks of a Chinese invasion?
Well, let's talk about South Korea first. So the EIU actually, in the middle of last year, around summer, we published a free report looking at the economies that are most exposed to a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And we identified South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines as the most exposed in Asia. And really, a conflict over Taiwan would be a global conflict, but with the epicenter in Asia, we would see a disproportionate effect on those three economies that I just mentioned. The reason for that is not just because of geographic proximity, but also the fact that, say, South Korea has a very strong security relationship with the US. Under a potential China-Taiwan cross-strait conflict scenario, we would likely see US intervention. And if the US were to get involved in a conflict, there is a high risk that it could mobilize its alliances with South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, to force them to partake in the conflict as well. Beyond that, because you have troops that are stationed in all three of those countries, there would be a risk of potential Chinese attack on those countries to kind of neutralize US supply lines. And so really the risks of a localized cross-strait conflict rippling out and becoming a much bigger regional or even global conflict, those risks are very, very real. And that's something that I think policymakers across all countries in Asia really need to be aware of. Now, in terms of the risks around an actual invasion of Taiwan by China, we are relatively optimistic. We have a benign view. We don't think that China is going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. And the reason for that is China has looked very closely at Russia's experience in Ukraine. Russia has become an international pariah. Its relationships with the rest of the world have really suffered, and its economy has also, in some ways, stagnated. For China, one of the things that China is dealing with diplomatically right now is this idea that other countries feel they have to choose sides between China and the US. And no country wants to do that. Whether you're South Korea or Japan, whether you're Malaysia, Singapore, or Vietnam, China is your biggest market, even if the US might be an increasingly important security partner. If China were to invade Taiwan, that would make the choice very clear for those third countries in that they would forcibly be pushed into the US camp because China would be changing the status quo. And so we have a relatively benign view that we don't think China is going to invade. But we shouldn't minimize the risks. As China enhances its harassment of Taiwan, whether that's around military exercises around Taiwan or intrusions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, each time that happens, that raises the risk of a miscalculation, such as a collision between fighter jets on the Chinese side or the Taiwanese side, firing of an errant missile, and that could very easily cause us to spiral into a bigger conflict. And so those risks are very much there, even if we don't think China would intend to purposely invade Taiwan anytime soon. Now, for South Korea, in terms of looking at the economic implications of this, we do think South Korea would be incredibly affected, not only because of the shocks to the Chinese economy and to the Asian trade landscape, but also the fact that a lot of South Korean trade moves through the Taiwan Strait or around the Taiwan Strait. There's also a very big risk that a conflict over Taiwan could spark similar issues in the South China Sea or even along the Korean Peninsula. And so South Korea would be very exposed to maybe the secondary shocks of conflict, the fact that there could be a domino effect of conflicts erupting all around the region. And given the country's geography, there is a heightened risk of a disproportionate effect to South Korea itself.
China's youth unemployment rate rose to a record high of over 20% last summer. Then the country temporarily stopped releasing the figures before resuming this year. And EIU forecasted in its latest report that China's youth unemployment will likely stay elevated this year. So can you give us more details on this outlook and how that will impact the Chinese economy?
Youth unemployment is a massive area of political concern because it directly impacts social stability. I think one of the reasons why the Chinese statistical authorities decided to remove the series from publication hesitation in 2023 not only was because they genuinely wanted to refine it, but also because it was such a sensitive topic. And I think the scrutiny over this was making policymakers in Beijing quite nervous. Our outlook for youth unemployment is still relatively pessimistic, and that largely reflects this growing mismatch in skills between, say, what is available in the talent landscape and what companies are looking for. I think one of the big issues that we're seeing right now with college graduates is the fact that they are graduating with professional degrees that they can't utilize. And so this is a symptom of the slowing economy. This is a symptom of industrial rectification campaigns. So, for example, the shocks to the internet sector or the education sector, those were both big drivers of youth employment. And so when we saw those industries come under regulatory scrutiny, suddenly that cut off job prospects for a lot of people who saw those industries as very lucrative. I think beyond that as well, there is just this sense that if you do find employment, potentially you are getting underemployed. You might graduate with a degree in social sciences, but then end up working as a delivery driver. And so even if we look at kind of the youth unemployment numbers, it might not fully capture the fact that underemployment is still very much a thing in China. So I think this is having pretty interesting consequences around consumption patterns. There has been a tightening in spending habits, particularly among younger consumers in response to a lot of this economic uncertainty. And that's reverberating out to the rest of the economy as well as kind of general consumption sentiment. And so there are a number of implications here in terms of how these policy choices can really constrain kind of how households feel about the economy and in turn their willingness to spend and their willingness to drive the Chinese economy forward as a result.
After being the worst performer in the Asia Pacific region in 2023, the Chinese stock market is struggling again, and Chinese authorities have pledged to stabilize the market without sharing details. And some experts have evaluated that the market has hit its bottom. So can you give us your analysis on this?
Well, we don't forecast the stock market directly, but one of the things that we look at structurally is, why is the market responding in this way? And ultimately, it is an issue of confidence. People just don't feel confident about the direction of the economy. And some of the moves that we've seen just in the last couple of weeks, efforts to replace kind of the head of the Securities Commission, for example, those are optical moves. Those are moves that are meant to send a message, but they don't fundamentally address the issues that are depressing investor confidence. This fact that you don't know where China's geopolitical relations are going to evolve in the next couple of years. You don't know which industries are going to be targeted as part of the next rectification campaign. You don't know if a certain policy comes out, it might be so disruptive that they will eventually have to withdraw it. All of these issues around uncertainty can be tied to kind of the centralization of political power and the policy drift that we've seen as a result of that. There have been some significant impediments to policymaking as well as policy execution, which are some of the reasons for why the economy has underperformed in the past couple of quarters, particularly after the zero COVID rebound or the expected rebound. I think those issues, those structural issues in the economy are feeding a lot of this uncertainty and they're depressing investor sentiment. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the market in the current state that it is right now. And that's a situation which, unless this uncertainty is resolved, could persist. This stock market pain could persist for quite some time.
A recent Goldman Sachs conference on Chinese equities for investors in Hong Kong, more than 40% of those surveyed said that they believe China was uninvestable. What is your prospect for foreign investor sentiment in China?
Foreign investor sentiment is definitely under pressure. I'm not sure if we can completely call it uninvestable, given that there are still a lot of companies who are genuinely in the market, who still see China as an important part of their, say, top 5 market strategy. But the fact that investors are saying that it's uninvestable should be ringing alarm bells. That indicates that sentiment really is in a place that I don't think we've ever seen it before. I think the stories that, people kind of had about China in the 2010s, when things get bad, they would inevitably kind of bottom out and get good again. I think that narrative is somewhat breaking down. This faith that things are eventually going to have a cyclical upswing, that faith is getting eroded. And so I think this year we will likely see some return in foreign investor sentiment, and that really ties to things that are outside China's control. So, for example, with the reduction in global interest rates, particularly by the US Federal Reserve, that will make borrowing cheaper, that will allow companies to feel more comfortable in terms of expanding their investments, that will reduce somewhat of the interest rate differential between China and the US and kind of stem this trend of profit repatriation from China to get higher returns on assets held elsewhere. All of those things point to a return in foreign investor sentiment and foreign investment inflows. But again, I don't think we're going to see the same enthusiasm around the Chinese markets anytime soon, benchmarked against what we saw in the 2010s, when China was kind of slowly opening its capital markets and there were banks that were really chomping at the bit to play a role in that and to get part of that pie. I think that sentiment is going to take a lot more time to rebuild, and it really again comes down to confidence.